All right, let's jump right into it. We're going to tackle one of the most complicated questions in modern history, the story of Palestinian statehood and the long, winding road of peace negotiations. We're going to break down the key moments that got us to where we are today.
It's a huge question, right? It sits at the very heart of this conflict. I mean, for more than 75 years, there have been plans, negotiations, wars. So why hasn't an independent Palestinian state ever actually become a reality? That's what we're going to unpack.
So here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we have to go back to the beginning, to 1948. Then we'll walk through the history of all those peace talks that didn't work out. After that, we'll look at the different systems of government and rights for both sides. And finally, we'll dig into how radical ideas have impacted everything.
Okay, so let's rewind the clock. You really have to start in 1948. This was the year that many people see as the first and maybe the most important shot at creating two states for two people.
So the United Nations steps in with a proposal, Resolution 181. The idea was simple: partition the land, create one Jewish state and one Arab state. The response, though? It was immediate, and it was completely divided. The Jewish leadership said, yes, let's do it, but the Arab leadership gave it a hard no.
And this rejection wasn't just, a no thanks at a meeting. It got real fast. The day after the UN vote, civil war broke out. Then, in May of 1948, the British mandate ends, Israel declares independence, and immediately 7 neighboring Arab armies invade. When the dust settled a year later, there was no new Palestinian state. Instead, Jordan was in control of the West Bank, and Egypt was in control of the Gaza Strip.
So you have to ask, why didn't the Palestinian Arab state just pop up right then and there? Well, it really boils down to a couple of huge factors. First, the rejection of that UN plan, which led directly to war. And second, when the fighting was over, the Arab countries that controlled the West Bank and Gaza, Jordan and Egypt, didn't create a Palestinian state on that land.
And this isn't a short period of time we're talking about. For 19 years, think about that, almost 2 decades, from 1948 all the way to 1967, Egypt controlled Gaza and Jordan controlled the West Bank. And during that whole time, no independent Palestinian state was established.
Okay, so that sets the stage. Now let's jump forward to the more modern eras of peace talks. And as we go through this, you're going to see a pattern emerge pretty quickly. A story of offers made and offers rejected.
Let's zoom in on a really key moment, the Camp David Summit in the year 2000. You've got Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and President Clinton making a huge offer to the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat. The deal included a Palestinian state in Gaza and most of the West Bank. The big condition? Arafat had to declare that this was the end of the conflict. Well, Arafat said no, and he didn't even come back with a counteroffer, and what happened next was a massive wave of violence known as the Second Intifada.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because you had one offer on the table, but 2 completely different ways of seeing it. From the Israeli and American viewpoint, they'd made a generous offer that was turned down because the Palestinian leadership just wasn't ready to end the conflict for good. But from the Palestinian viewpoint, the offer wasn't generous at all. They saw it as creating a non-viable state, kind of like a Bantustan, broken up and with Israel still controlling all the important stuff, like borders, airspace, and water.
And look, Camp David wasn't a one-off thing. This pattern played out again and again. You had the Oslo Accords in the 90s, which were supposed to build trust, but were instead followed by terrible waves of violence. Later on, you had more frameworks proposed by President Clinton, by Israeli Prime Minister Olmert in 2008, and Prime Minister Netanyahu in 2009, and all of them were ultimately rejected by Palestinian leadership for one reason or another. Of course, at the same time, something else was happening that you can't ignore. Israel continued to build settlements, which many observers say just destroyed trust and made any kind of negotiation that much harder.
So we've talked about the diplomatic history, the offers and rejections. But to really get the full picture, you have to look at what's going on internally, with how both sides are governed. The political reality on the ground plays a huge role.
And when you put the two systems side by side, the differences are pretty stark. Israel is a parliamentary democracy, it has regular multi-party elections, and it's rated as free by the organization Freedom House. On the other hand, you have the Palestinian Authority. They haven't held a national election since 2007. The president basically rules by decree, and according to polls, the vast majority of Palestinians believe their own institutions are corrupt.
Now let's talk about the Arab citizens inside Israel proper. They make up about 1/5 of the population. So what does their status look like on paper? Legally, they have full citizenship. That means Israeli passports, the right to vote, the right to run for parliament, and they can even serve as judges on the Supreme Court. These rights are protected by Israel's basic laws,
And this is where we get into a really heavy and, frankly, very contentious debate. Now, lots of sources will tell you that Arab citizens in Israel face real discrimination, and that's a serious issue. But some experts draw a sharp line. Here's a quote from Benjamin Pogrund, a guy who actually fought against apartheid in South Africa. He says that the legal setup in Israel is fundamentally different from apartheid because, unlike in South Africa, Arab citizens have citizenship and the right to vote. It's a key distinction he makes.
Okay, for our last piece of the puzzle, and it's a big one, we absolutely have to talk about radicalism. These are the ideological beliefs that often become massive, unmovable barriers to ever finding a lasting peace.
Let's take Hamas, the group that rules Gaza. There are very specific reasons why countries like the US and the EU officially call it a terrorist organization. You can look right at its founding charter, which calls for the destruction of Israel. It chooses armed conflict over any negotiation, and it has a long, documented history of targeting civilians, from suicide bombings to rocket attacks, and of course, the massive attack on October 7th.
And this kind of ideology isn't just happening in a vacuum. It gets major support from outside players, especially Iran. Since the 1979 revolution, Iran's official state policy calls for the elimination of Israel. And they don't just talk about it. They actively fund and arm proxy groups around the region like Hamas and Hezbollah to try and make it happen.
So this all ties into a really important distinction that gets debated constantly. Where is the line between criticizing a country's policies and something else? Most people agree criticizing the Israeli government is perfectly legitimate. It's not anti-Semitic. But the line often gets drawn when anti-Zionism is used to say that the Jewish people, and only the Jewish people, don't have a right to self-determination. Many people consider that a form of anti-Semitism.
So, after all that, where does it leave us? We've seen a history packed with mischances, totally conflicting stories about the same events, and really deep-seated anger. Every offer, every rejection, every act of violence is seen through a completely different lens depending on who you ask. And that brings us to the toughest question of all. When two people see the past so differently, how on earth do you build a shared future?